Imagine you are standing in the center of a hostile map. You are 1,000 miles from the nearest friendly border. You are surrounded by an empire that wants you dead. Your generals have been beheaded. You have no food, no maps, and no guides. In front of you lies a mountain range that no army has ever crossed, and the biting cold of a winter for which you have no clothing. This is not a myth. This is the year 401 BC. This is the true story of 10,000 soldiers who voted to walk home. The story begins not with war, but with a family dispute. In the year 401 BC, the Persian Empire was the superpower of the world. To the average Greek, and to us looking back, it was unfathomably large. It stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea all the way to India. It was wealthy, bureaucratic, and ancient. The king of this empire was Artaxerxes II, but his younger brother Cyrus wanted the throne. Cyrus was the governor of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and he knew that while the Persian army was vast, it was slow. He knew that if he wanted to seize the throne in Babylon, he needed a different kind of weapon. He needed the heavy infantry of the Greeks. Cyrus sent messengers across the Aegean Sea with bags of gold derricks, Persian coins stamped with the image of an archer. He hired mercenaries. From the rugged mountains of Arcadia, from the streets of Athens and the barracks of Sparta, they came. They were called hoplites. Picture the gear of these men. Each man carried a shield, the aspis, which was a 3-foot circle of wood faced with bronze. It weighed nearly 20 pounds. On their heads, they wore bronze helmets that covered their cheeks and noses, turning them into faceless statues of war. In their hands, they held spears of ash wood, 8 feet long. 10,000 of these men gathered at the city of Sardis. They were a terrifying sight, a moving wall of bronze and muscle. But there was a problem. Cyrus had lied to them. He told them they were marching to fight a local hill tribe called the Pisidians. He knew that if he told them the truth, that they were marching to overthrow the King of Kings in the heart of Babylon, they would never have come. And so the march began. It was a slow, rhythmic grind. An ancient army moves at the speed of an ox cart, perhaps 12 miles a day. For months, the sound of 10,000 pairs of sandaled feet echoed through the dusty plains of Turkey. They crossed the Taurus Mountains, passing through the Cilician Gates, a pass so narrow that a single wagon could barely squeeze through. As they marched deeper into the continent, the landscape changed. The green hills of the coast gave way to the flat, beige expanse of the Syrian desert. The heat became a physical weight. The men began to suspect the truth. They saw the sun rising in front of them, not to their side. They were going east and south. When the truth finally broke that they were marching on Babylon, the soldiers nearly mutinied. They threw stones at their general, a harsh Spartan named Clearchus. But they were soldiers of fortune, and they were already halfway there. Cyrus promised them more money. He promised them silver. He promised them the plunder of the empire. Greed and the inability to turn back pushed them forward. They crossed the Euphrates River on rafts made of stuffed animal skins. They entered Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. The air smelled of wormwood and baked clay. They were now deep in the belly of the beast. It was late summer when the two armies finally met at a place called Cunaxa, just north of Babylon. The Greeks were resting when the scouts rode in, shouting that the king was coming. The horizon turned white with dust. Then the dust turned dark, and within the darkness, flashes of bronze and iron began to sparkle. The king, Artaxerxes, had brought an army that outnumbered the rebels 3-1. The Battle of Cunaxa was a strange, disjointed affair. The Greeks were stationed on the right flank. When the order came, they did not wait. They charged. They screamed their war cry, "Elelu, Elelu," and banged their spears against their shields. The sound alone was terrifying. The Persian left wing, composed of lightly armed conscripts, routed before the Greeks even reached them. The Greeks chased them for miles, slaughtering them, suffering almost no casualties.
To the Greeks, the day was a total victory. They had crushed the enemy. They went to sleep that night on the battlefield, hungry but triumphant, expecting to be paid the next morning. They did not know what had happened in the center of the line. In the center, Cyrus, blinded by ambition, had charged directly at his brother, the king. He had wounded Artaxerxes, but was struck under the eye with a javelin. Cyrus the Younger was dead. The next morning, the news hit the Greeks like a hammer. Cyrus was dead. The rebellion was over. They were not the victors, they were orphans. Now they were a small island of men in an ocean of enemies. The king sent messengers demanding they surrender their weapons. The Greek general Clearchus replied with a Spartan laconicism that echoes through history. If the king wants our weapons, let him come and take them. A tense standoff ensued. The Persians were afraid to attack the heavy Greek infantry, but the Greeks had no way to get home. A Persian satrap named Tissaphernes offered to negotiate. He smiled. He offered them food. He promised to guide them back to the sea. It was a trick. Tissaphernes invited the 5 leading Greek generals, including Clearchus, to a feast in his tent to sign a peace treaty. The generals, desperate for a solution, agreed. They walked into the Persian camp. They entered the tent. A red flag was raised. Inside, men with swords sprang from behind the curtains. The generals were seized, bound, and dragged away to be beheaded. Outside, the Persian cavalry swept down and butchered the Greek captains waiting by the entrance. The surviving Greeks, watching from their camp miles away, saw the commotion. One man, clutching a wound in his stomach, ran back to the lines and gasped out the news. "They are all dead. It is a trap." That night was the darkest night in the history of the Greek military. Xenophon, who was there, the historian who had tagged along for the adventure, wrote that few men tasted food that evening and few kindled a fire. They lay on the ground, unable to sleep, thinking of their wives and children they would never see again. They were leaderless, they were surrounded, they were 1,000 miles from Greece. But in the silence of that despair, a new resolve was born. Xenophon, who was not a general, but a student of Socrates who had tagged along for the adventure, stood up. He called the remaining officers together. "We have no leaders? Then we are the leaders. We have no food? Then we will take it. We have no way home? Then we will walk." They held a vote. In the middle of hostile territory, the army became a moving democracy. They elected new generals. They decided to burn their wagons, their tents, and their extra clothes. They kept only their armor and their swords. They formed a hollow square. The heavy infantry formed the 4 walls of the box. Inside the box, they put the baggage animals, the camp followers, and the wounded. They became a walking fortress. They could not go back through the desert. They had no water. They had to go north. North meant the mountains. North meant the land of the Carduchians, modern-day Kurdistan. The march through the Carduchian mountains was a nightmare of vertical warfare. The Carduchians were fierce, independent hill tribes who answered to no king. They lived in villages perched on cliffs. As the Greeks marched through the deep ravines, the Carduchians rolled massive boulders down from the heights. The rocks smashed men to pulp. Arrows rained down, massive arrows, so large the Greeks later used them as javelins. The Greeks had to fight for every inch of elevation. They stormed the peaks at night, climbing hand over hand in the rain, just to clear the road for the main army below. For 7 days they did not sleep. They bled, they fought, but they climbed. They broke out of the mountains and descended into the highlands of Armenia. If the mountains were a trial of fire and blood, Armenia was a trial of ice and silence. It was now winter. The elevation was high. The wind blew from the north, carrying a stinging, freezing grit. The Greeks were wearing tunics and sandals. They had no winter gear. The snow began to fall. It fell until it was 6 feet deep. The army became a snake of black dots moving through a white void. Men began to die, not from arrows, but from the cold. Xenophon describes a condition he called bulimia, an ox hunger. Men would simply collapse in the snow, their blood sugar crashed, their bodies shutting down from exhaustion. Xenophon ran up and down the line, forcing food into their mouths, rubbing their frozen limbs, shouting at them to stand up. "If you stop," he told them, "you die." Frostbite took a terrible toll. Men's toes turned black and rotted off. Some men were blinded by snow blindness, the glare of the sun on the white expanse burning their retinas. They had to be led by hand, stumbling in the dark. At night they slept in the snow. If they were lucky, they found a warm patch of ground. If they were unlucky, they never woke up. They came across subterranean villages, houses built underground to escape the harsh winter. The locals were bewildered by this army of frozen metal men. The Greeks, desperate and starving, drank barley wine, an ancient form of beer, through reeds from great clay jars, sharing the drink with the locals in a strange, uneasy truce. They marched for months. The 10,000 became the 8,000. They were gaunt, their skin stretched tight over their bones, their armor rusted, their tunics reduced to rags, but they kept placing one foot in front of the other. It was the year 400 BC. The army had been walking for a year. They were moving through the land of the Macrones. A local guide promised them that he would lead them to a mountain from which they could see the sea. The Greeks were skeptical. They had been lied to by Cyrus, lied to by Tissaphernes, and attacked by every tribe they met, but they followed him. The mountain was called Mount Teshes. The vanguard of the army began to climb. Xenophon was in the rear guard, fighting off a skirmish, when he heard a strange sound coming from the front of the column. It started as a low murmur, then grew into a roar. Xenophon thought it was another battle. He mounted his horse and rode forward, fearing the vanguard was being slaughtered. As he got closer, the roar became rhythmic. It became a chant. The soldiers were not screaming in pain. They were shouting a single word over and over again. "Thalata! Thalata! The sea! The sea!" Xenophon reached the summit. There, miles in the distance, shimmering gray and blue under the cold sky, was the Black Sea. The Black Sea meant Greek colonies. It meant ships. It meant trade. It meant the end of the walking. The hardened soldiers, men who had killed without mercy and eaten raw meat to survive, fell to their knees. They wept openly. Captains hugged privates. Generals cried in the arms of their aides. They built a massive cairn of stones on the mountaintop, placing their walking sticks and ox-hide shields upon it as an offering to the gods. They had done the impossible. They had walked into the heart of the Persian Empire, defied the King of Kings, and walked out again. They had proven that a free, disciplined army could survive against any odds. They eventually reached the Greek city of Trapezus, modern Trabzon. They held athletic games to celebrate their survival. They raced down the steep slopes toward the water, laughing, their bodies broken, but their spirits intact. Their journey paved the way for history. Decades later, a young Macedonian prince named Alexander would read Xenophon's book, the Anabasis. He would trace their route on a map. He would realize that the Persian Empire was hollow, vast, but weak. He would use their lessons to conquer the world. But for the 10,000, conquest didn't matter. They had achieved something greater. They had survived. The sun sets on the water. The waves lap against the shore. The long march is over. Good night.